So a canvasser came by my door yesterday and they wanted to ask me if I was voting. Of course, I responded and explained to them that I wasn't 100% sure. I kind of had a lackluster motivation for voting. He of course asked me why, and so I went through the normal talking points that you've heard on this platform quite a few times about the benign neglect of the Democrat Party, about some of my issues with Kamala Harris, about those issues. But of course I prefaced this by first explaining to him that I'm nobody's Republican and I understand the overt racism of the Republican Party. With that being said, it was still very difficult to find motivation to vote in this presidential election for Democrats, because I obviously, for specifically Kamala Harris, because I recognize that she just doesn't seem like she truly understands the plight of Black America in this country, and because of that I just wasn't really willing. Upon having that conversation, I did record it, but I had my phone in my pocket, so a large portion of the conversation there was a lot of rustling and things like that, so I felt like it wouldn't have been good for content, even though it was a really good conversation. I was really spitting. So I wanted to actually go ahead and explain it to you guys in a certain way. For one, what I explained to him was I hate the idea of us constantly having a vote of aversion, which is voting against Donald Trump. Not because I like the Democrat candidate, but because I recognize that Donald Trump is such a threat. If you remember when Biden was running, there were bumper stickers that were saying, okay, fine Biden, but this is BS, right? Or okay, fine Biden, but F this, right? Where people were basically saying, fine, I'll do it, but not really being motivated. What I explained to that person was, if I ended up voting and I voted for Kamala or any other type of Democrat, it wasn't because I cared for that person, but because I didn't think that Republicans were beneficial. So when I was discussing this conversation with one of my good friends, I ended up breaking down to him, Kamala Harris has absolutely not earned my vote, and I mean that. But then I went on to explain that Donald Trump earned my vote against him. He constitutes a really huge threat. If you guys remember, when I had that conversation with Tariq Nasheed, I was critical of both parties, but I'm starting to recognize that some people can't do both things. I want you to stick around to the end of this video, because I think I'll make it crystal clear. For one, let's talk about Republicans. When I mention that Republicans have overt racism towards Black people, we can look historically and keep on going. If we start even at something like the VRA, right? The Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was specifically created because there was insane amounts of voter discrimination and voter suppression for Black people in the southern states. They had gone out of their way to create poll taxes. They created a grandfather's clause. The grandfather's clause basically says that if your grandfather was able to vote before the Civil War, then you can vote as well. Now, that never mentions Black people, but before the Civil War, Black people couldn't vote, meaning any white person automatically qualified and any Black person didn't qualify. So they did that without saying Black people. Trust me, this is actually a valid point, because it comes up when we start talking about more voter suppression that's going on right now. Poll taxes. Well, obviously when you have Black people who are just now freed because of the Civil War, who are now freed after fighting in that war, those people don't have a lot of money, so taxing the polls discourages them from voting. Another form of suppression was literacy tests. This is where they give you a test and say, if you can't provide proof of a 5th grade education, then you need to pass a literacy test in order to vote. Well, I mean, if the literacy test is so confusing and ridiculous, then of course you can't pass that literacy test. This is one of the exact literacy tests that was given out in Louisiana. Look at some of these questions. Look at number 1. Draw a line around the number or letter of the sentence. What does that mean? They mean around the 1? What letter of this? Do they mean just the letter A? Because it's a single letter? What? Or do they want the word number? I don't know what they mean there. Look at number 10. In the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with an L. I'm guessing they mean within circle 1 that you're going to be writing T, because that's the first word that begins with L, I'm guessing. I think so. That one seems like it. You might be able to understand that one. But let's get to number 12. Draw a line from circle 2 to circle 5 that will pass below circle 2 and above circle 4. Here's what's bizarre about it. If you miss a single answer, you didn't pass the test. Now again, this doesn't ever mention Black people, but who couldn't provide a 5th grade education? Black people. Because there wasn't the same type of public school, right, that ensured that everyone was allowed to go to school. There was still like discrimination in education and segregation. This is why separate but equal actually wasn't equal. So they did these things where it didn't explicitly say Black people, and it wasn't only Black people that might fall prey to this, but the aim and target was black people, and they were going to do different things in order to make that happen, right? This is like black codes, where they passed a bunch of laws in the South, during Reconstruction, where it says, we're going to say vagrancy is a crime. We're only going to enforce it against black people, but we never said black people. So we can target black people without saying that we're targeting black people, because we never said them. But it's only ever going to be enforced against black people. It's a black tax, it's a black code. So when all of these things are happening, eventually they had a bunch of intentional sit-ins, a bunch of people like doing registration drives and trying to force black people to be able to be registered to vote. And they were, of course, encountering insane amounts of violence and intimidation and actual murders and having houses burned down and churches burned down that participated, and doing everything they could to suppress the black vote. Eventually it becomes very, very clear when a bunch of white students as well, white college students, are actually pushing to help black people register to vote, and some of them are murdered and harmed, that eventually they say, okay, we need the federal government to step in, or else black people are just never going to get a right to vote. So the federal government steps in and they start ensuring that people can do it, and then they eventually pass the Voting Rights Act. What the Voting Rights Act did was it banned literacy tests, and it made it so that any state that had a history of voter discrimination had to get federal approval before they could change some of their laws regarding their elections and some of their polling stations and things like that. And the reason is because obviously they understood, well, now that we've banned literacy tests and we've banned these other things, some of them, they'll just find another way. So if you're going to do anything, you have to get approval. In Shelby County versus Holder, basically someone challenged that they weren't able to change the laws. And the reason why is they said, well, these rules were made 50, 60 years ago, and they don't necessarily apply now. And it doesn't seem fair that we're being held to this standard, but not everywhere is held to this standard. They challenged it and said basically that it needs to be universal, and that you can't prove that the racism that existed back then still applies today. So then that means we should be allowed to go ahead and change our rules, change our laws, change the way we implement voting. Of course, eventually the Supreme Court ruled in favor that yes, that it's not completely fair that some states have to be held to this and others don't. Bearing in mind that the states that had to be held to it were the states that had done voter suppression, the ones that had histories of segregation. You're the ones that we got to say, if you're going to make a rule, we got to double check, because we know you guys are going to try to work around it. Immediately after that passed, within hours, several southern states immediately passed voter ID laws. Now people ask, what's wrong with voter ID? Well, let's look into it. For example, in North Carolina, very, very shortly after the Shelby ruling by the Supreme Court, they passed a whole bunch of election reform. The reforms had a bunch of restrictions. That some of them had, one of them was a very strict voter ID, a reduction in days that you could early vote, and you couldn't register on the same day to vote. Before they made these laws, what they did was they asked for voter tendencies by race, for voter information by race. Then they targeted specifically the way black people were more likely to vote. And then they made laws against those ways of voting. They looked at the type of IDs that black people were more likely to present, and then made the voter ID restrictions for the IDs that black people weren't likely to present. Then they recognized that a lot of black people did do some same-day registration, because people would go out and, encourage them to vote, and they'd be like, okay, I hadn't thought about it, but fine, I'll do it. And so then they would register on that day and vote. It was overwhelmingly black. So they eliminated those things. These are like black codes. They didn't say black people, but they were targeting black people, which is why they asked for the information by race. The Supreme Court ruled against them, and one of my favorite lines is they said, you targeted the black vote with almost surgical precision, because they asked for this data, and once they had the data, we're like, oh, this is the way that black folks vote. We'll just put rules against all of those things, trying to suppress the black vote yet again. Alabama, same thing. Alabama implemented a very strict photo ID law almost immediately after Shelby as well. It required voters to show government-issued photo identification at the polls. Additionally, and see, this is where it's like, okay, sure, we should be able to show ID. That's not that big of a problem. Then the next thing that they did was they started closing the driver's license offices in black neighborhoods. So we say you have to have a driver's license, and then we start closing the driver's license offices in your area. But then a lot of people can't get new IDs, and so then they can't vote. Now, for people like in the state of California, you're going to be like, oh, that's crazy. Who wouldn't have an ID? And some of the other states, you'd say, well, that's crazy. They should have an ID. Of course they're going to have an ID, because IDs don't expire, or they don't expire as frequently. Well, some states IDs expire every year. Some states it might be 2 years. California, I believe, is 5 years. So if I already have my ID, chances are I'm going to be able to vote, and within that 5-year period, I'll be able to get it. But what if I'm a state that my ID expires every 1 year, right? And now you close the ID part, so then you make it very inconvenient for me to go get a brand new ID, right? And you do this on the year when we're voting. What if you're doing that with that intention, or you're doing it shortly before we vote, right? These are the things where you would be trying to intentionally suppress a vote. Florida tried to restrict early voting, specifically in black neighborhoods. So the thing that was in the VRA was a thing called pre-clearance. That meant if you wanted to make a change like this, if you wanted to close a voting station, or you wanted to close a registration station, in order to do that, you needed pre-clearance from the federal government. They'd have to look and say, okay, why are you closing this one? And this is where it gets crazy, because you start finding out that voting increased dramatically. Registrations to vote increased dramatically, yet polling centers and voting centers went down by 10%. 10%. So then that means more people are registering to vote, and then you're specifically removing it. Like, you're specifically removing areas for them to vote, and they're doing it specifically in black neighborhoods. And so then you end up in situations like in North Carolina, and it also happened in Texas, where a person trying to vote takes 5 hours to vote. They leave all the stations open in white neighborhoods so that a person can go in and vote in less than 15 minutes. But you close all but one in the black neighborhood so that all the black people have to spend hours and hours and hours. Hours and hours and hours. And then you even go as far as saying you're zoned. You're only allowed to vote in the place that you're zoned to. So you can't just drive to the white neighborhood and vote, because no, you're not zoned there. You have to vote in your specific district. Well, my district only has one voting center, and the lines around the building, and it's going to take me 5 hours to vote. And voting isn't a federal holiday, so you're trying to discourage the vote. It's another black code. So when people ask questions like, well, why is a voter ID such a problem? Then you can see, oh, the reason why voter ID is a problem is because it's not just that you do that. Then you move the DMV 50 miles away from the black neighborhood, hoping that people who don't have cars won't be able to go get new IDs. Or you start making specific types of IDs, the type that black people are less likely to have, right? And they're normally accompanied with things like getting rid of early voting and things like that, which black people are more likely to do, because if they have essential jobs, then they can't take off of work in order to go vote, or they would have to take off of work in order to go vote. Whereas if you can do it early, you can do it at different times, and you don't have to worry about those 5-hour lines on the last day. Or what happens if a state like Georgia decides to start purging their voter rolls, so that all these black people don't have the right to vote, but don't know that they don't have the right to vote. And then they simultaneously close same-day registration. So when you go to discover, oh shoot, I can't vote because I'm not on the freaking voter roll, you can't go register that day and go vote. Why would you do that? Because you want to discourage the black vote. So Republicans have all of their racism, their suppression. So for all of these reasons, I will never be a Republican, right? And that's exactly what I explained to the canvasser. I'll never be a Republican. But that doesn't mean that I'm a Democrat. Democrats have done nothing to earn my vote. Biden got into office and said,
the African American community stood up again for me. You've always had my back, and I'll have yours.
And then he mentioned that the racial wealth gap was an important thing that he needed to help close. What has he done to close it? It's actually expanded. Student loan forgiveness in the form that he was trying to do it would have expanded the racial wealth gap, because the majority of people that go to college were white. The majority of student loan debt held in the country is white. The majority of Pell Grant recipients were white, who obviously got a bonus $10,000. It was going to expand the racial wealth gap. What did he actually do to earn that? I'm still yet to figure out how did he have the African American communities back. I'm not going very much into Kamala's policies, because that's a whole nother conversation. My point being, up till now, the Democrat Party has still continued to practice benign neglect. You've heard me very commonly advocate for abstention. We shouldn't be participating. And the reason why I would be saying that is because obviously I don't believe that abstention is inaction. It's not a call to inaction. It's more of a strategic decision aimed at pressuring Democrats to genuinely address our community's needs. Because as it stands now, the Democrat Party hasn't gotten the majority of the white vote since about 1964. It's us. We're voting. When you know that they haven't gotten that vote since 1964, but they're still not addressing our needs, then it says that they're taking our vote for granted. And they have every reason to. We voted for them every time. A statement that was made when I was growing up was, why buy the cow when the milk is free? They are taking our vote for granted, and they know even if we don't do what they want, they'll still vote for us. When black people are the largest recipients of hate crime, Asians are getting hate crimes at about a 1-to-20 ratio in comparison to black people. And we can have a Stop Asian Hate movement when the largest recipients of hate crimes in this country are black people, disproportionately as well. It says benign neglect. It says that you know who to play to, and it says that you're willing to ignore our community's needs. And the only reason you would do that is because you're taking our vote for granted. I'm going to close with saying this, and I mean this. Donald Trump is dangerous. Project 2025 is dangerous. When you know that there were people who worked for Trump who are authors of Project 2025, and you can have a person who's running as the president of the United States and he's saying he never read it. Meanwhile, the Heritage Foundation, one of the 4 largest and most influential think tanks in America, in the world actually, when they're writing this, and a guy who's running to be president of the United States says that he didn't read it, nor any of his staff, yet people who have worked for him are some of the authors, or some of the authors he then hires and says that he doesn't know anything about it. And then you start seeing overlap. He talks about getting rid of the Department of Education, and they're talking about getting rid of the Department of Education. When he's talking about immunity for officers, and they're talking about expanding immunity for officers and getting rid of consent decrees. The point being, there is overlap. Donald Trump is dangerous. And Democrats have not earned my vote, but as I said, Donald Trump earned my vote against him. I'm in the state of California. If I don't vote, don't matter. The electors are still going to Kamala Harris. So I don't have to have that on my conscience that I voted for Kamala Harris. But if I was in a different state where my vote mattered, I could see myself truly contemplating voting for her out of aversion for Trump. He does represent a threat. When you start talking about expanding immunity to officers, you scare me. You lost me. He is dangerous. And you ask yourself if you genuinely believe Donald Trump has what's in Black Americans' best interest. I think we all know better. Besides the psychopaths online on Twitter that will sit there and say, I'm voting for Trump. I don't know what those people are seeing. Review my conversation with Tariq Nasheed. I point out that Donald Trump is harmful. Ever going to be a Democrat? I'm never going to endorse a Democrat. Even in my advocacy for voting against Trump, it's not an endorsement of Kamala. I don't believe in her policies. I don't think she has what's best for us. But again, Donald Trump earned our vote against him. Do you truly want another world, a world with 4 more years of Donald Trump? That's the fear. I said a lot. I hope it makes sense to you. Truly consider the future that you want. And it's not a future. I don't want a future of Kamala Harris, but I do want a future without Trump. MAGA is dangerous. Let me know what you guys think.